Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. A long time ago, in a city of China, there lived a poor tailor with his only son, Aladdin. Now, this boy had been obstinate and lazy ever since the day he was born, and when he became 10, his father wanted him to learn a proper trade. But since he lacked the money to pay for his son's apprenticeship in another craft, he had to take the boy into his own shop and teach him how to use a needle. However, since Aladdin was so stubborn and idle and preferred to play with the scamps in his neighborhood, he did not spend a single day in the shop. Instead, he would wait for his father to leave the shop for some reason or other, like paying a debt, and then he would run off at once to the gardens to be with some other little scoundrels. Such was his situation, and neither punishment nor good advice would help. He would not obey his parents or learn a trade. As a result, his father became so sick due to his son's vicious personality and indolence that he died. Despite his father's death, Aladdin continued to carry on as badly as he had done in the past, and when his mother saw that her son would not change, she sold the shop with all its contents and began spinning yarn to make a living. This work enabled her to feed herself and Aladdin, who became increasingly more lazy and wayward, especially when he no longer had to fear his father's stern reproaches. Indeed, the only time he came home was for his meals. Otherwise, his poor mother continued to toil for the both of them, while he persisted in his idle ways until he turned 15. One day, while Aladdin was playing in the neighborhood with some of the other vagabonds, a dervish from Maghrib, the land of the setting sun, came by and began gazing at the boys. However, he did not appear to notice anyone except Aladdin and kept staring at him. Now, this dervish, a Moor from the interior of Morocco, was a sorcerer whose magic powers were so powerful that he could turn mountains upside down. Moreover, he was adept in astrology, and after looking at Aladdin very closely, he said to himself, "This is the boy I've been searching for ever since I left my native land." So he took one of Aladdin's friends aside and began asking questions about him, such as who his father was. And he tried to learn all he could about Aladdin and the circumstances of his life. Once he was satisfied, the magician walked up to Aladdin, drew him aside, and asked, "My son, aren't you the son of the tailor Mustafa?" "Yes, my lord," the boy answered, "but he died a long time ago." Upon hearing these words, the Moor threw his arms around Aladdin, embraced him, and began kissing him, while tears trickled down his cheeks. Of course, the boy was surprised by the magician's behavior, and he asked, "Why are you weeping, my lord? Did you know my father?" "How can you ask me a question like that, my son?" replied the Moor. "Don't you realize how sad it makes me to learn that your father, who was my brother, is now dead? I was living in exile for many years and looked forward with joy to seeing him again and talking about the past. And now you've told me that he's passed away. But blood is thicker than water, and I had a feeling that you were my brother's son. I recognized you at once among all the boys. Of course, when I left the country, your father had yet to marry. Unfortunately, I've lost the joyous opportunity of seeing my brother again, and I've also missed the funeral services. But this was all due to the fact that I was far away and that Almighty Allah had decreed that this was the way it was to be, and there is no tinkering with fate. Now, my son, you are my only joy and comfort, and you are his replacement. As the saying goes, he who leaves an heir does not die." After the Moor had spoken these words, he stuck his hand into his purse, pulled out 10 gold pieces, and gave them to Aladdin. "My son, take this money and give it to your mother with greetings from me.
Let her know that your uncle has returned from exile, and that, God willing, I'll visit her tomorrow to see the house where my brother lived, and also to have a look at his burial site."
Thereupon Aladdin kissed the Moor's hand, and after running at full speed and with great joy to his mother's house, he entered and surprised her, for he never came home except at mealtimes. "Mother," he exclaimed in his delight, "I've come to bring you good news about my uncle, who's returned from his exile and has sent me to greet you." "My son," she replied, "you're mocking me. Who is this uncle of yours? And since when have you ever had a living uncle?" "How can you say I don't have living uncles or relatives when this man is my father's brother?" Aladdin cried. "Indeed, he embraced and kissed me, and when he heard about my father's death, he wept bitter tears, and then he told me to inform you about his arrival." "My son," she responded, "I know very well that you had an uncle once, but he's dead, and I was not aware that you had another." The next morning, the magician went looking for Aladdin, for his heart could not bear to be separated from him. As he wandered about the city, he finally encountered him playing in the streets with other scamps and vagabonds, as he usually did. When the Moor approached him, he took Aladdin's hand, embraced him, and kissed him. Then he pulled 2 dinars from his pocket and said, "Go to your mother and give her these ducats. Tell her that your uncle intends to eat with you this evening, and that she should prepare a delicious supper for us. But before you do this, show me the way to your house once more." "Just follow me, uncle," said Aladdin, and he ran ahead, pointing out the street leading to his house. Then the Moor left him and went his way, while Aladdin ran home and gave the ducats and the news to his mother. So she arose right away and went to the market, where she bought all that she needed. After returning to her dwelling, she borrowed pans and platters from her neighbors, and when the meal was cooked and supper time came, she said to Aladdin, "My child, the meat is ready, but perhaps your uncle does not know the way to our dwelling. So go out and meet him on the road." "As you wish," he replied. But before the two could finish their conversation, they heard a knock at the door, and when Aladdin opened it, the Moor stood there, attended by a eunuch who was carrying wine and fruit. So the boy let them in, and the slave went about his business. After entering, the Moor greeted his sister-in-law with a salam, began to shed tears, and said,
"Show me the place where my brother used to sit."
She pointed to the place, and the Moor went to it, prostrated himself in prayer, and kissed the floor.
"How meager is my satisfaction," he cried out. "How unfortunate I am, for I've lost you, brother, light of my eyes."
And he continued weeping and wailing like this until he fainted. Consequently, Aladdin's mother was convinced that he was sincere and that he really was her husband's brother. She went over to him, and after lifting him up from the floor, she said, "Please stop, or else you'll kill yourself." And Shahrazad noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale, and said, Aladdin's mother began consoling the Moor and led him to the couch. As soon as he was seated at his ease and was waiting for the food to be served, he began talking to her and said,
"You must be wondering, my good sister-in-law, why you never saw me or knew anything about me while my late brother was alive. The reason for this is that I left this city 40 years ago and wandered all over the lands of India, Sind, and Arabia, and finally settled down in the magnificent city of Cairo in Egypt, which is one of the wonders of the world. Thereafter, I traveled to the interior of Morocco, where I lived for 30 years. Then, one day, as I was sitting alone at home, I began thinking about my native land and my late brother. and my yearning to see him became so strong that I bemoaned my exile and the distance between my brother and myself. Finally, I decided to return to my birthplace and to see my brother once more, saying to myself, "Oh, you unhappy man, how long will you wander like a nomad from your birthplace and native land? You only have one brother and no more. So rise and return to him before you die. Who knows what might happen to you and what changes might happen in the course of time? It would be most sad if you died without ever seeing your brother again. Allah has blessed you with ample wealth, and your brother might not be as fortunate as you are, whereby you might be able to help him in his distress." So I arose at once, prepared myself for the journey, and recited the Fatiha. After the Friday prayers ended, I mounted my steed and traveled to the city, suffering many hardships and encountering all sorts of dangers along the way. But I patiently endured them and was blessed by the Lord's protection until I reached my goal. After I entered the city, I wandered about, and the day before yesterday I saw Aladdin playing with some boys on the street. By God, the moment I saw him, my heart went out to him, and I felt deep down that he was my nephew, for we are of the same blood. In fact, as soon as I spotted him, I forgot my trials and tribulations and became ecstatic. However, when he told me about his father's death, I fainted out of disappointment. Perhaps he has told you how sorrowful I was and how I reacted. Nevertheless, I'm somewhat consoled by the sight of Aladdin, my brother's son, for whoever leaves an heir does not die.
After hearing these words, Aladdin's mother began to weep, and the Moor now sought a way to complete his deception. So while he comforted her, he turned to Aladdin and asked,
"My son, what craft have you learned? What work do you do to support yourself and your mother?"
The boy was abashed and put to shame. He hung his head and lowered his eyes, but his mother spoke out. "What work? Indeed, he's never learned a thing. I've never seen such an ungrateful child as this one. Never. He wastes the entire day with the other scamps and vagabonds of the neighborhood, like himself. He drove his father to his grave, and he'll do the same with me too. I spend cotton and toil at the spinning wheel day and night, so that I can earn a couple of scones of bread that we eat together. By the life of me, the only time I see my son is at meal times and none other. Indeed, I've been thinking about locking the house door and never opening it to him again. Then he'll have to go and seek a livelihood and earn a living. After all, I've gotten on in years and no longer have the strength to work the way I do. By Allah, I'm forced to provide him with his daily bread, when I'm the one who should be provided for." Upon hearing this, the Moor turned to Aladdin and said,
"Why are you doing this, nephew? Why are you so ungrateful? Your behavior is disgraceful and unworthy. You're a sensible young man and the child of honest folk. Indeed, you should be ashamed that your mother at her age should have to struggle to support you. Now that you've reached manhood, it is incumbent upon you to learn some trade and to support yourself. Praise be to Allah, there are numerous craftsmen in the city, and there are many different trades. So choose something you would like to learn, and I'll help you get established. Later, when you're grown up, you'll be able to support yourself in your own business. Perhaps you didn't like your father's profession, and if that's the case, then choose some other craft that may suit you better. Then let me know, and I'll help you as best I can."
However, Aladdin kept silent, and the Moor realized that Aladdin preferred to continue living the life of a freeloader and a vagabond. So he said to the boy, "I did not mean to be so harsh and severe."
"I did not mean to be so harsh and severe, nephew. If you really don't want to learn a craft, despite all that I've said, I'll open a merchant shop for you and furnish it with expensive stuffs. Then you can deal in trade with other merchants and become well known in the city." Now, when Aladdin heard his uncle's words and his plan of making him a merchant and a gentleman, he rejoiced, for he was quite aware of the fact that these people dressed in fine garments and had sumptuous meals. So he looked at the Moor, smiled, and nodded his head to show that he was content. "Well now," said the Moor, "since you're willing to let me open a shop for you and make you a gentleman out of you, then I'll take you to the bazaar first thing tomorrow morning, God willing, and I'll have a fine suit of clothes cut out for you like the one merchants wear. After that, I'll look for a store for you, as I've promised." Up to this point, Aladdin's mother still had some doubts as to whether the Moor was her brother-in-law. But when she heard his promise of opening up a merchant's shop for her son and providing him with stuffs and capital, she cast them to the wind and decided that the Moor was in truth her husband's brother, for a stranger would never do as much as he was doing for Aladdin. So she advised her son to mend his ways, get rid of his foolish ideas, and prove himself a man. Moreover, she told him to obey his excellent uncle as though he were the Moor's son, and to make up for all the time he had wasted with his vagabond friends. After this, she rose, set the table, and served the supper, whereupon they all sat down and began eating and drinking. During the meal, the Moor conversed with Aladdin about business matters and other similar topics, so that later that night, after the Moor had departed and promised to return early the next morning, Aladdin could barely sleep for joy. Indeed, as soon as dawn arrived, the Moor knocked at the door, and Aladdin's mother opened to let him in. However, the Moor would not enter. Instead, he asked permission to take the boy to the market, and Aladdin went straight to him, wished him good morning, and kissed his hand. Then the Moor took him to a clothier's shop at the bazaar and asked to look at expensive suits that were finely tailored and ready to wear. The merchant brought him what he desired, and the Moor said to the boy, "Choose whatever you like." Aladdin was extremely happy about his uncle's generosity, and he picked out the suit that pleased him most. Whereupon the Moor paid the merchant for the garments, and they left. Soon the Moor led the boy to the Hammam baths, and after they bathed, they drink sherbets. They drink sherbets together. Then Aladdin rose, put on his new garments with great joy, and went to his uncle, kissed his hand, and thanked him for all his favors. When they left the Hammam, the Moor took Aladdin to the bazaar again and showed him how people traded at the market, buying and selling. And he said, "My son, it is important for you to become familiar with the people here, especially the merchants, so that you can learn their business, now that you are one of them." Then he showed Aladdin the city with its mosques and other interesting sights. Finally, they entered a cookery, where dinner was served to them on silver platters. After eating and drinking their fill, they continued on the walk, and the Moor took Aladdin to the parks, the magnificent buildings, and the Sultan's palace, where they visited the grand and elegant apartments. Finally, they went to the Khan of foreign merchants, where the Moor had taken his lodgings, and he invited various traders to have supper with them and told them that Aladdin was his nephew. By the time they had finished their meal, it was dark, and the Moor rose up and took the boy back to his mother, who mistook her son for a merchant, but was extremely delighted when she recognized him. Immediately, she began expressing her gratitude toward her false brother-in-law for his kindness, and said, "I can never thank you enough for your generosity. You are most kind." "Please don't consider this mere kindness," said the Moor. "The boy is my own son, and it is incumbent on me to assume the role of my brother, his sire. So I hope you will be satisfied." "May Allah bless you and grant you long life for my sake," so that you keep this orphan under your wing. And I hope that he will be obedient and do whatever you ask him to do. Oh, I guess that's the gal, sorry.
May Allah bless you and grant you long life for my sake, so that you may keep this orphan under your wing. And I hope that he will be obedient and do whatever you ask him to do.
Aladdin has now become a man of good sense, the Moor replied. I pray to Allah that he will follow in his father's footsteps and be a comfort to you in your old age. But I regret that tomorrow being Friday, I shall not be able to open his shop, since it is the day when all the merchants go to the parks and gardens after congregational prayer. On Saturday, however, we shall start his business, Allah willing. Meanwhile, tomorrow, I'll come and take Aladdin for a pleasant stroll to see the parks and gardens outside the city that he has perhaps never seen before. He'll also be able to see the merchants and notables who go there and make their acquaintance.
After saying this, the Moor went away and spent the night at the Khan. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, early the next morning, the Moor arrived at Aladdin's house and knocked at the door. Now, after all the delights that the boy had experienced the day before, he had not been able to sleep a wink all night and could hardly wait until daybreak. So as soon as he heard the knock, he rushed to the door, opened it, and saw his uncle, the magician, who embraced and kissed him. Then, as they began walking, the Moor said to him,
Nephew, today I'm going to show you a sight that you've never seen before in your life.
And he began to make the boy laugh and cheer him up with his pleasant talk. Once they left the city gate, the Moor took him through the gardens and pointed out the fine buildings and marvelous pavilions. Whenever they stopped and stared at a mansion or palace, the Moor would ask Aladdin whether he liked it. Indeed, the boy was ecstatic and in seventh heaven because of the sights he had never seen in his entire life. Thus, they continued to stroll about and enjoy themselves until they became tired. Then they entered a huge, wonderful garden that was nearby, a place that delighted their hearts and eyes, for it had a fountain that spouted water from the jaws of a golden lion, and the water flowed swiftly among an abundance of flowers. They found a nice place to sit down in the garden, near a pond, and rested a little while. Soon Aladdin began to jest with the magician and to have fun with him, as though the Moor were really his father's brother. Then the Moor stood up, loosened his belt, and pulled out a bag full of dried fruits and other good things to eat.
Perhaps you are hungry, nephew, he said. Take whatever you'd like to eat.
Aladdin responded by sticking his hand into the bag, and the Moor ate with him. After they were refreshed and rested, the magician said,
Get up, nephew. If you're no longer tired, let's stroll onward and finish our walk.
Thereupon Aladdin arose, and the Moor accompanied him from garden to garden until they had left them all behind and reached the base of a huge and barren hill. Since the boy had never gone beyond the city gates and had never taken such an extensive walk as this, he asked the Moor, Where are we going, uncle? We've left the gardens behind us, and there's nothing but open country from here on. I'm tired and can't go on. So if there are no more gardens after this, let's return to the city.
No, my son, said the magician. This is the right way. You see, there are more gardens after this, and we're going to look at one that is more splendid than any royal garden in the world and beyond comparison with those you have just seen. So pluck up your courage. You're a man now. Praise be to Allah.
The Moor began to cajole the boy and to tell him wondrous tales, true stories as well as lies, until they reached the spot the magician had come all the way from Morocco to China to see. Upon arriving at their destination, the Moor said to Aladdin,
Nephew, sit down and take a rest, for this is the spot we've been looking for. If Allah is merciful, I'll soon be able to show you marvelous things that nobody in the world has ever seen before. Indeed, no one has ever had the pleasure of viewing that which you are about to see.
After they had relaxed a while, the Moor spoke again.
Once you have rested, my son, I want you to get up and look for some wood chips and dry sticks so that we can start a fire. Then I'll show you things beyond your imagination.
Now, when Aladdin heard these words, he longed to see what his uncle intended to do, and forgetting how tired he was, he arose right away and began gathering small wood chips and dry sticks until the Moor cried to him,
Enough, nephew, enough!
Soon the magician took out a small box from his breast pocket, and after opening it, he took some incense, set fire to the wood, and sprinkled the incense on the fire. Then he conjured and uttered some strange words, and the sky darkened. Suddenly there was a burst of thunder, and the ground split open. Aladdin was so startled and frightened that he wanted to flee, but the Moor saw this and grew extremely angry, for without the boy his work would come to nothing. It was only with Aladdin's help that he would be able to obtain and open the hidden treasure. So he got up and gave the boy such a hard smack on the back of his head that his back teeth were almost knocked out, and Aladdin fell to the ground in a swoon. After a while, the Moor revived him with some magic, and Aladdin wept and asked,
Uncle, what have I done to deserve such a beating?
In response, the Moor began to comfort him and said,
My boy, it is my intention to make a man out of you. Therefore, don't contradict me, for I'm your uncle, and you are like a son to me. Obey everything that I tell you to do, and soon you'll forget all your hardships and become absorbed by all the marvels I'm about to show you.
Then the Moor looked down into the crack in the ground and showed Aladdin a marble slab that had a copper ring attached to it. After striking a geomantic table, he turned to Aladdin and said,
If you do everything I tell you, you'll become richer than all the kings of the world. That's why I struck you. There is a treasure down there in your name, and you are about to run away and abandon it. But now, pull yourself together.
And Shahrazad noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said,
The treasure is under that marble slab,
the Moor continued.
So place your hand on the ring and raise the slab. Nobody but yourself has the power to open it, and no mortal on this earth except yourself may set foot in this hidden place, for the treasure has been destined for you. But you must follow all of my instructions carefully, and remember every word I tell you. All this, my son, is for your own good. The treasure is of immense value, and it is worth more than any king on this earth has ever accumulated. Bear in mind that we shall share all this together.
So poor Aladdin forgot the slap on his head and his tears. Indeed, he was dumbfounded and overjoyed that he was fated to become richer than a sultan. Therefore he cried out,
Uncle, tell me what to do, and I'll obey all your orders.
Nephew, replied the magician,
you are like my own child, and even dearer to me because you are my brother's son. Since I have no other relatives, you will be my heir and successor.
After saying this, he went over to Aladdin and kissed him.
Now you know why I have done all this work. It has been all for your sake, my son. You will become a rich and great man. So do exactly as I tell you, and go to the ring and lift it.
But uncle, Aladdin answered,
the ring is much too heavy for me. I can't lift it all by myself. You must come and help me. for you're stronger than I am." "Nephew," the Moor replied, "if I help you, all your work will be in vain. You must place your hand on the ring and pull it, and the slab will rise right away. Remember, I told you that nobody can touch the ring but you. However, while you are raising it, you must pronounce your name and the names of your father and mother, and you'll see that you'll be able to lift the slab with ease."
Thereupon the boy mustered up his strength and set his mind to the task. He followed the Moor's instructions carefully, and before he knew it, he had lifted the slab and had cast it aside. Right below him was a stairway with 12 steps that led to a subterranean cave.
"Aladdin," the Moor said, "get a grip on yourself and do exactly what I tell you. I want you to descend the stairs to the vault as carefully as possible. Once you are at the bottom, you will find a space divided into 4 apartments, and in each one of these you will see 4 golden jars and other valuable articles made of gold and silver. Beware all of these things. Do not touch them or allow your garments to even brush the jars or the walls. Leave them where they are and continue walking forward until you reach the 4th apartment. If you don't do what I say, you'll be turned into a black stone. Now, when you reach the 4th apartment, you'll find a door which you will open, and after pronouncing the words that you spoke over the slab, you're to enter and go through a garden adorned by fruit trees. The path that you're to take is about 50 yards long, and it leads to a terrace that has a ladder with some 30 rungs. And you will also see a lamp hanging from the ceiling of the terrace. If you're to climb the ladder and take the lamp, after pouring out the contents, place it in your breast pocket. You don't have to worry about damaging your clothes since the contents are not made of common oil. On your return, you may pluck whatever you want from the trees, for they are yours as long as the lamp is in your hands.
Now, when the Moor finished giving his instructions to Aladdin, he drew a ring from his finger, placed it on one of Aladdin's, and said,
"My son, this ring will protect you from all harm and threat, but only on the condition that you bear in mind all that I've told you. So it's up to you now. Go to it and be brave and determined. You're a man now and no longer a child, and very soon you'll be the richest man in the world."
Eagerly, Aladdin descended into the cave, where he found the 4 apartments, each containing 4 jars of gold. He walked by them with utmost care and caution, just as the Moor had told him to do. From there, he entered the garden and walked down the path until he came upon the terrace, where he mounted the ladder and took the lamp, which he extinguished by pouring out the oil. After placing the lamp in his breast pocket, he descended the ladder and returned to the garden, where he began gazing at the trees and noticed that the birds were singing songs in praise of the great Creator. Now, he had not realized upon entering that all the trees were covered with costly gems as their fruit. Moreover, each one had a different kind of jewel with various colors of green, white, yellow, and red. They all glistened, and their radiance made the rays of the sun in its midday brightness appear pale in comparison. Indeed, the size of each stone was beyond description, and it was evident that there was not a king in the world who owned a single gem equal to the larger sort, or who could boast of even one that was half the size of the smaller kind. Aladdin began walking among the trees and was surprised and bewildered by what he saw. In place of common fruit, there were all sorts of fine jewels and precious stones, such as emeralds, diamonds, rubies, spinels, balances, pearls, and other gems that were dazzling to the eyes. And one and since the boy had never seen anything like this in all his livelong days, and since he had no idea of the worth of such valuables, he being still but a boy, He thought that all these jewels were made of glass or crystal. So he gathered them and began filling his pockets, checking to see whether they were fruits such as grapes or figs. However, he found that they were all made of some glassy substance and said to himself, "They'll make wonderful playthings when I get home." He continued plucking numerous gems and crammed them in his pockets until they were stuffed full. After that, he picked others and placed them in his belt and the folds of his garments. Then he hurried back along the path for fear that his uncle might become angry with him. As he went through the 4 apartments and passed by the 4 jars of gold, he did not touch them, even though he would have been allowed to take some of the contents on his way back. Finally, when he came to the stairs of the cave, he began climbing until he reached the last step. However, finding that this one was higher than all the others, he needed help to mount it. So he said to the Moor, "Oh, uncle, lend me a hand so I can climb out." But the magician answered, "First, give me the lamp to lighten your load. It's probably weighing you down." "It's not the lamp that's weighing me down," Aladdin responded. "Just lend me a hand, and as soon as I reach the ground, I'll give it to you." Since the Moor's only goal was to obtain the lamp, and none other, he began to insist that Aladdin give it to him at once. But the boy had placed it at the bottom of his breast pocket, and his other pockets were bulging with gems. Therefore, he could not reach it with his fingers to hand it over, causing the magician to explode with rage. Indeed, the Moor persisted in demanding the lamp, while poor Aladdin could not get at it. Thinking that the boy wanted to keep the lamp for himself, the magician was now convinced that he would not be able to obtain it. In his fury, he ran over to the fire, threw more incense on it, and uttered some magic words. Within seconds, the power of the magic caused the marble slab to slide over the entrance to the cave, preventing Aladdin's escape. Now, as I mentioned above, as I mentioned before, the sorcerer was really a stranger and not related to Aladdin in any way. He had lied to the boy and had used him only so that he could obtain the treasure that had been intended for Aladdin. This Moor was an African born in the interior of Morocco, and from his childhood on, he had been addicted to witchcraft and had studied and practiced every kind of occult science. Indeed, the city of Tunis itself is notorious for this unholy lore, and he continued to read and hear lectures there until he became a master in all kinds of sorcery and spells that he had acquired after 40 years of study. Here's a picture of the Moor trying to get the lamp from Aladdin. Then one day he discovered through a satanic inspiration that there was a treasure hidden in one of the remote cities of China named Al-Khalaz, a treasure that no king on earth could ever match. The most marvelous thing in this enchanted treasure was a wonderful lamp, and whoever possessed this magic lamp would become the richest man on earth and mightier than any king of the universe. However, the magician discovered that this treasure could only be opened by a poor boy named Aladdin, who lived in that Chinese city. And after he ascertained how easy it would be to obtain the lamp through the boy, he traveled to China and did what he did with Aladdin, thinking that he would become Lord of the Lamp. But when his attempt and hopes were thwarted and all his work went to waste, he decided to let the boy die there and heaped the soil on top of the entrance while saying to himself, "I have not touched a hand to him, and hence there is no murder." Once he was sure that it would be impossible for the boy to escape with the lamp, he made his way back to Africa, sad and dejected. So much for the magician. As for Aladdin, He began shouting to the Moor when he heard the earth being heaped on top of the marble slab, for he still believed that the magician was his uncle. He begged him to lend a hand so that he might get out of the cave, but no matter how loudly he yelled, there was no reply. Soon it became apparent to him that the Moor had deceived him, and that the man was no uncle, but a liar and a wizard. Consequently, poor Aladdin became desperate, for he was certain there was no escape. After weeping a while about his misfortune, he stood up and descended the stairs to see if Allah Almighty had somehow provided him with a way of escape. He turned to the right and to the left, but saw nothing but darkness and four walls. For the sorcerer had locked all the doors through magic, and had even cut him off from the garden to make sure that the boy would die. Then Aladdin's weeping became greater, and his wailing louder when he found all the doors shut tight, especially since he had hoped to find some solace in the garden. So there was nothing to do but to return and sit upon the stairs that led to the entrance of the cave. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story.